In the middle of a Europe torn apart by war, a thin, bespectacled French philosopher walked into a dim Parisian café carrying a manuscript that would redefine modern thought. This was Jean-Paul Sartre, and the manuscript was Being and Nothingness, a vast and difficult book born in 1943 but carrying a message that feels even heavier today: the terrifying freedom of human existence. Sartre insisted that human beings are not guided by destiny, biology, tradition, or divine plans, but by something far more unsettling: absolute freedom, a freedom so total that he would say, man is condemned to be free, as though freedom were not a blessing but a weight, a burden, a responsibility so immense that most people spend their lives trying to escape it. To understand Sartre is to stand at the edge of the void and look directly into it, to confront the unsettling idea that there is no predetermined purpose to our lives, no essence that defines us from birth. Instead, as Sartre famously declared, existence precedes essence, meaning we are thrown into the world first and only afterward choose, create, and invent what we are. Unlike a paper knife, which is created with a clear design and purpose in mind, human beings appear without instruction, without blueprint, and without justification, forced to define themselves moment by moment through action, choice, and commitment. This sounds liberating, but Sartre wants us to feel its full weight. With no God to design us, no social role that excuses us, no nature that dictates us, we must bear the responsibility for every decision we make, and thus for the kind of person we become. There is no hiding, no deflecting, no escaping. This is the beginning of Sartre's complete philosophy, a vast existential landscape where consciousness reveals itself as a peculiar kind of being, neither fixed nor solid like a stone, but open, fluid, incomplete, a constant movement toward possibilities. Sartre distinguishes between two fundamental modes of being: being in itself, the solid, unconscious, self-identical being of objects, and being for itself, the conscious, questioning, restless being of humans. A rock simply is what it is. It cannot choose or reflect or deny itself. But consciousness is a wound, a crack in the solidity of being, a constant escape from itself. It is defined not by what it is, but by what it is not yet. Consciousness is lack, possibility, negation. This is why Sartre says that human beings are nothingness, not as an insult but as a description. Consciousness is a nothingness that haunts being, a gap that allows us to step back, reflect, and say no, to negate what is and choose something else. This negative power is what makes choice possible. It is the space in which freedom lives. But it also produces anguish, abandonment, and despair, the existential trio that Sartre believed every honest person must confront. Anguish arises when we fully grasp the weight of our freedom, the realization that nothing and no one can choose for us. Abandonment follows from the death of all higher authorities. If God does not exist, Sartre says, then we are abandoned, left alone, with no excuses behind us or before us. Despair emerges when we realize we cannot rely on anything outside our own decision-making, not fate, not probability, not other people. These conditions are not psychological states but structural truths about human freedom. To be human is to be free is to choose, and to choose is to be responsible. This responsibility is so heavy that many people flee from it into what Sartre calls bad faith, the self-deception through which we pretend we are things, objects, fixed identities without freedom. The waiter who performs his role with exaggerated precision, the woman who insists she is just following orders, the lover who denies the possibility of betrayal. These are Sartrean examples of bad faith, moments when a person lies to themselves about their freedom in order to escape anguish. Bad faith is tempting, but it is also fragile because we can never fully believe our own lies. Consciousness always knows it is free. And if self-deception is difficult, relations with others are even more complex, because Sartre believes that the presence of another consciousness introduces a fundamental tension. The other transforms us from a free subject into an object under their gaze. Sartre's famous line, "Hell is other people," does not mean that people are inherently bad. It means that the gaze of another person objectifies us, fixes us, limits our possibilities, and threatens our freedom. This dynamic gives rise to conflict, shame, pride, domination, and even love, which Sartre sees as a struggle between two freedoms, each trying to possess the other without being possessed. Sartre's entire philosophy, from metaphysics to ethics to politics, emerges from this vision of human beings as free, self-creating, and responsible in a world without inherent meaning. His later work attempts to build an ethics of authenticity grounded in commitment and action, and a political philosophy that reconciles individual freedom with collective struggle. Understanding Sartre's complete philosophy is to explore consciousness, freedom, responsibility, bad faith, the gaze of the other, love, ethics, and the human condition in its rawest form. And now we will continue our descent into this vast existential universe, expanding each idea with depth, clarity, and narrative weight as we move through Sartre's metaphysics, psychology, ethics, and politics. As we move deeper into Sartre's existential universe, we must confront his most difficult and influential idea: that consciousness is fundamentally a nothingness that inserts itself into being, carving out possibilities where none existed before, and this nothingness appears most dramatically in the experience Sartre calls negation, the ability to imagine what is not, what could be, what should be, or what must be avoided. When you enter a cafe looking for a friend and discover he is not there, consciousness performs a small miracle. It turns an absence into a presence, gives shape to nothingness, and reveals itself as a being defined by what it lacks. This is why Sartre says that human beings are creatures who make nothingness happen in the world. And this power is double-edged. On one side it allows freedom, choice, and imagination, but on the other it exposes us to despair, regret, nausea, and the awareness that we alone are responsible for what we bring into the world. Sartre's entire phenomenology is an exploration of how this nothingness manifests in daily life. In how we hesitate before making a decision, in how we regret our past actions, in how we project our desires into the future, and in how we redefine ourselves moment by moment through the stories we tell about who we are. To be human is, for Sartre, to be incomplete, unfinished, a constant surpassing of oneself toward new possibilities, and this constant surpassing is what he calls transcendence, the movement by which consciousness flees the present state of its being toward a not yet realized future. But this transcendence is always grounded in facticity, the brute facts about ourselves we cannot change. Our birthplace, our past, our current situation, the limitations of our bodies. Facticity and transcendence interlock like two gears. We are never free from our situation, but we are always free to interpret, modify, or transcend it. This is Sartre's central insight. That freedom is not the ability to do absolutely anything, but the ability to take whatever situation we are given and choose what it means, choose how to respond, choose who we will be within it. Even imprisonment does not negate freedom. Sartre famously said that even a prisoner is free to choose how he responds to his captivity, whether with resignation, rebellion, hope, despair, or dignity. This radical freedom horrifies many because it tears away the comforting illusions humans often use to justify their lives. Luck, fate, talent, trauma, destiny, but Sartre insists that we must face it head-on if we want to live authentically. And yet, authenticity is rare because human beings are specialists in fleeing from themselves, slipping into bad faith whenever the truth becomes too heavy. Bad faith is the attempt to treat oneself as an object, to deny one's own freedom by clinging to fixed identities. I am this kind of person, I had no choice, it's just who I am, my past defines me. These statements may feel comforting, but for Sartre they are lies because the self is not a thing, it is a project. Sartre's great example of bad faith is the waiter who plays his role as if he were a mechanical object, exaggerating his gestures, his politeness, his efficiency, performing waiterness, instead of simply being himself performing the job. He hides behind the identity because it excuses him from confronting the open-ended nature of his freedom. Another example, the woman on a date who leaves her hand in the man's without deciding what it means. She suspends her freedom to avoid making a choice about the situation, refusing both acceptance and rejection. In each case, the individual splits themselves in two, the object self, fixed and determined, and the subject self, fluid and free. Bad faith is the attempt to pretend we are only the object and not the subject, only the facts and not the possibilities, only the past and not the future. Yet the most profound dimension of Sartre's philosophy emerges when another consciousness enters the scene, the other whose gaze transforms our world. In the presence of another person, Sartre says, we experience a profound transformation. We become aware that we are an object in their world, something they can judge, evaluate, interpret, desire, or fear. This is the famous gaze or the look, a foundational idea of modern existential psychology. When someone looks at us, we feel ourselves from the outside as though we are being seen through an X-ray. Our freedom collides with their freedom and suddenly we experience shame, not because we have done something wrong, but because we realize we can be seen, interpreted, reduced, or defined by someone else. Sartre's iconic example is the voyeur peeking through a keyhole, completely absorbed in his activity, existing in pure subjectivity, until footsteps echo in the hallway and he becomes aware of being observed. In that instant, his world collapses. His body becomes heavy, his intentions exposed, and he feels shame because he has been caught in the other's gaze, transformed from a free consciousness into a visible object. This dynamic, the collision of freedoms, explains why human relationships are fraught with conflict. Sartre believes that love, too, is infected by this struggle, because each lover secretly wants the other's freedom while simultaneously wanting to possess the other's love completely. Lovers oscillate between wanting to be adored as an object, desirably, completely, unquestionably, and wanting the other to freely choose them in every moment. This contradiction gives rise to what Sartre calls the sadomasochistic struggle of love, in which each person tries to claim the other as an object while denying their own objectification. And yet, Sartre does not present human relationships as hopeless. Rather, he insists that mutual recognition is possible but fragile, always threatened by the tension between freedom and objectification. From this psychological tension emerges Sartre's existential ethics, which appears only in fragmented form in Being and Nothingness but becomes central in his later works. The idea that authenticity is the acceptance of one's own freedom and the simultaneous recognition of the freedom of others. Authenticity requires lucidity, courage, and responsibility. It requires rejecting bad faith and accepting that we are the authors of our lives and that other people are authors of theirs. From here, Sartre moves toward politics, arguing that freedom is not merely an internal experience but a condition that must be supported or destroyed by social structures, institutions, and historical forces. His later philosophy attempts to combine existential freedom with Marxist analysis, exploring how social oppression restricts the lived experience of freedom and how collective struggle can restore it. Through this evolution, Sartre never abandons the core idea that human beings are self-creating projects, constantly transcending their facticity through action. To understand Sartre is to understand the weight of responsibility that comes with being human, the terrifying realization that we must choose who we are, that we cannot escape freedom, that even refusing to choose is a choice, and that our lives, in the end, are nothing more than the sum of the commitments we make. This, then, is the path we now walk, deeper into Sartre's metaphysics, further into his ethics, toward his political philosophy, and into the heart of his vision of the modern human condition, where freedom, nothingness, and responsibility form the ground on which every one of us must stand. And as we advance further into Sartre's philosophical universe, the next crucial element to unravel is how he connects the solitary experience of individual freedom with the vast and often brutal machinery of history, society, and political struggle, because Sartre increasingly realized that no consciousness exists in a vacuum, and while we are always absolutely free internally, the external world, economic systems, class structures, governments, wars, ideologies, shapes the range of possibilities available to each person in ways far more complicated than his early work allowed. Sartre's wartime experiences, especially his time as a prisoner of war during World War II, profoundly deepened his understanding of how freedom interacts with oppression, leading him to expand his ideas in ways that integrate the existential with the political. He saw that freedom is always situated, always entangled with the material world, and that individual liberation requires social conditions that allow choice to flourish. This is where Sartre's philosophy begins to morph into a broader historical analysis, culminating in works like Critique of Dialectical Reason, where he tries to reconcile existentialism with Marxism without sacrificing the radical individuality at the heart of his earlier writings. He argues that human beings form groups out of necessity, because while the individual consciousness is free, individuals alone lack the power to transform oppressive structures. Therefore, collective action becomes the means through which freedom can express itself on a larger scale. But Sartre refuses any deterministic view of history. He insists that even within collective movements, individuals remain responsible, that revolutions are made from a series of free choices, not from impersonal forces or historical inevitabilities. This commitment to freedom becomes the basis for his lifelong political activism. He opposed colonialism fiercely, supported anti-imperialist struggles, criticized the bourgeoisie, and engaged with intellectual and political movements across Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Yet he never abandoned existentialist insights. He insisted that activism without self-awareness becomes dogma, and self-awareness without activism becomes complacency. This dual commitment shaped his views on morality as well. Sartre believed that ethics could not be built on universal rules or abstract principles but must arise from the concrete situations people face and the choices they make within them. Unlike Kant, who believed in universal moral laws, Sartre believed that values are created, not discovered, and that each person must invent their moral framework through committed action. The burden of this responsibility is immense. It means we cannot hide behind religion, tradition, ideology, or authority. To act is to declare to the world what we believe a human being ought to be, and in this sense, every choice is a kind of moral legislation. Thus Sartre's ethics is an ethics of authenticity, integrity, and courage, an insistence on facing the world without excuses, embracing uncertainty and acting even when no guarantee of success exists. This emphasis on commitment, engagement as he called it, became the defining feature of his later work, especially his essays on literature, art, and politics. As a literary critic, Sartre argued that writers bear a moral responsibility, because language is a form of action. To write is to intervene in the world, to shape consciousness, to expose injustice, or to reinforce it. He believed that literature should be engaged, not escapist, that artists must confront their era, not withdraw from it. This belief drove his exploration of biography as a philosophical method, culminating in his monumental studies of Baudelaire, Genet, and Flaubert, where Sartre attempts to show how each writer's work emerges from the interplay of freedom and facticity, choice and circumstance, rebellion and constraint. These biographies are not merely literary studies, they are existential case studies, attempts to map the terrain of freedom within complex human lives. But Sartre's interest in the human psyche extended beyond literature. He also made major contributions to psychology, expanding on his theory of emotions from his early work. In The Psychology of Imagination and Sketch for a Theory of Emotions, he argues that emotions are not mechanical biological reactions but spontaneous transformations of the world by consciousness. When reality becomes too difficult to bear, consciousness reshapes it through emotion. Fear transforms danger into something overwhelming, anger transforms obstacles into enemies, sadness transforms loss into a heavy, immobilizing landscape. Emotions, for Sartre, are a way of fleeing or reshaping reality, an expression of our freedom, but also an expression of bad faith when they serve as excuses for inaction. From this psychological groundwork, Sartre builds a complex picture of human interiority, asserting that imagination is a fundamental structure of consciousness, not a secondary function. Without imagination there would be no freedom because imagination allows us to see the world not only as it is but as it could be, should be, or must be changed. This insight becomes crucial to understanding why Sartre believed that oppression works not only by restricting physical possibilities but by restricting imaginative possibilities, by making people believe that change is impossible. Therefore, resisting oppression begins with reimagining the world, refusing to accept the limits imposed by society, and reclaiming the power of transcendence. But Sartre does not romanticize revolt. He knows that rebellion brings its own dilemmas and contradictions, and he explores these tensions through his plays and novels, which dramatize the conflicts between authenticity and self-deception, freedom and necessity, action and paralysis. Works like No Exit, Dirty Hands, and The Devil and the Good Lord show characters grappling with impossible choices, moral ambiguity, political conflict, and the crushing weight of responsibility. Sartre uses drama to expose the tragic dimension of human freedom, that no matter what choice we make, we must live with the consequences, and we cannot predict or control how our actions will affect others. This tragic dimension becomes even more pronounced in his reflections on death, which he sees not as the completion of life but as its theft, an external event that renders our projects incomplete. For Sartre, death is absurd because it comes from outside, it is not part of our freedom but its annihilation. Yet death also gives urgency to life, reminding us that our time is limited and that every moment is a chance to shape ourselves, commit to our projects and define who we are. This urgency pulses through all of Sartre's work, fueling his relentless demand that we take responsibility for our existence. But responsibility for Sartre is not only an individual matter, it extends to the collective, because our choices always unfold within a world shared with others. This brings us to one of the deepest and most challenging aspects of his philosophy, the attempt to reconcile personal freedom with the freedom of others. Sartre recognizes that human relations are fraught with conflict, but he also insists that freedom is not a zero-sum game. The freedom of others does not diminish our own, it expands the field of possibilities we inhabit. Therefore, the task of life is not to dominate or manipulate others but to create conditions in which everyone's freedom can flourish. This is why Sartre commits himself to activism, because he believes that philosophy without action is empty, and that freedom must be defended not only within the self but within society. His engagement in political struggles, from anti-colonial movements to workers' rights to student protests, reflects his belief that existentialism must not remain a solitary meditation but must become a force that transforms the world. And so, as we journey deeper into Sartre's legacy, we uncover a thinker who not only diagnosed the human condition but insisted that we confront it with courage, creativity, solidarity, and an unflinching commitment to freedom, a thinker who refused fatalism, rejected excuses, and dedicated his life to showing that even in the darkest moments, the human being is capable of transcending its circumstances and reshaping its destiny. And this brings us into one of the most profound and difficult regions of Sartre's thought, the domain where existential analysis meets the lived texture of daily experience, because Sartre understood that freedom, anguish, responsibility, and transcendence are not abstract concepts reserved for philosophers. They are the substance of ordinary life, woven into even the smallest choices, desires, and relationships. For Sartre, the structure of consciousness is always intentional. It is always consciousness of something, and this intentionality reveals a world that is not inert but alive with meaning because meanings are created by consciousness itself. Yet consciousness is not a stable thing. It is a constant movement, a perpetual surpassing of itself, always escaping the present, always projecting itself into the future, and always haunted by the nothingness that makes freedom possible. This nothingness is not an abyss outside us. It is within us, the gap between what we are and what we could be, the inner vacuum that allows us to distance ourselves from our past, our roles, our identities, and the expectations placed upon us. It is because of this nothingness that we can decide to quit a job, end a relationship, change our beliefs, betray a tradition, resist an authority, or reinvent ourselves. But this same nothingness also generates our most intimate anxieties, because it reminds us that there is no solid core inside us, no essential self that can anchor our choices. We are what we do, and what we do is always open to revision, failure, and regret. This fragility of the self is what Sartre calls the sliding of consciousness, the way our identity constantly eludes us, slipping through our fingers the moment we try to grasp it. And this is why bad faith is so tempting. It promises stability, certainty, and relief from the burden of invention. But Sartre warns that the cost of bad faith is our freedom itself, for every lie we tell ourselves drives us deeper into self-denial, further away from authenticity, and more entangled in the illusions we build to avoid responsibility. These illusions take countless forms, pretending that our roles define us, claiming that we can't change, blaming circumstances for our inaction, treating emotions as irresistible forces, or invoking fate to avoid decision. Sartre exposes these self-deceptions not to condemn but to liberate, because he believes that once we recognize these patterns, we can begin to reclaim our agency. Yet the challenge becomes far greater when we encounter others, because the presence of the other disrupts our self-understanding in the most violent way. The other sees us from the outside, turning us into an object, a picture, an identity fixed by their gaze. This is the existential shock Sartre describes in his famous analysis of The Look. The sudden realization that we exist for others in ways we cannot control, that we appear as something in their world, subject to their interpretations, judgments, and desires. This experience is both humiliating and revealing because it exposes the gap between our inner freedom and the external image assigned to us. The look of the other does not steal our freedom, but it challenges it, because it forces us to confront the fact that we are not the sole creators of meaning in our world. Others participate in defining us, resisting our projects, shaping our possibilities. Relationships therefore become battlegrounds of freedom, arenas of subtle conflict where each person tries to reclaim subjectivity while resisting objectification. This is the existential truth behind jealousy, shame, pride, seduction, and hostility. They are struggles over who gets to define the meaning of the situation. Love, for Sartre, is not a peaceful union but a paradoxical attempt to possess the freedom of another without destroying it, an impossible project that inevitably oscillates between masochism and sadism. To love authentically would require loving the other's freedom, not their submission, and yet this ideal is almost impossible to achieve because the desire for security always tempts us to domesticate the other's freedom, to demand reassurance, to ask for promises that freeze the fluidity of existence. This tragic tension makes human relationships deeply unstable, filled with yearning and conflict, tenderness and disappointment, intimacy and distance. And yet Sartre insists that we must not abandon the project of connection. Instead, we must learn to engage with others without denying their transcendence. This is the foundation of his existential ethics. The recognition that my freedom is intertwined with the freedom of others, that I cannot be fully free unless the people around me are also free. This idea becomes the seed of Sartre's political philosophy, because it implies that oppression is the systematic denial of transcendence, the reduction of individuals to objects or roles that limit their possibilities. Colonialism, for instance, was for Sartre a monstrous system that suffocated the freedom of entire populations by imposing fixed identities upon them, turning them into instruments of someone else's project. His support for anti-colonial movements, especially in Algeria, Vietnam, and sub-Saharan Africa, was not just political but deeply philosophical. He saw in these struggles the most urgent and concrete expression of the fight for human freedom. Yet Sartre is careful not to sentimentalize resistance. He acknowledges that liberation is messy, fraught with contradictions, compromises, and moral ambiguities. Violence, in particular, occupies a complex place in his thought. While he does not celebrate it, he understands it as a potential consequence of oppression, a desperate attempt by the oppressed to reclaim agency when all peaceful avenues have been closed. This does not mean he endorses violence universally. Rather, he views it through the lens of existential responsibility, insisting that those who choose violence must confront the weight of their actions without excuses. This insistence on responsibility sets Sartre apart from deterministic ideologies, including rigid forms of Marxism. Even when he engages seriously with Marxist theory, he refuses to abandon his core belief that individuals are not puppets of economic structures or historical laws. They remain responsible agents capable of choice, even in constrained circumstances. This is why Sartre's critique of dialectical reason attempts to synthesize individual freedom with collective action without reducing one to the other. He sees society as a dynamic interplay of individual projects and collective systems, a field of tensions where freedom can be expressed, distorted, or reclaimed. In this context, he introduces the concept of the group infusion, a form of collective solidarity that emerges spontaneously when individuals recognize their shared situation and work together toward a common goal. Unlike rigid bureaucracies or institutionalized organizations, the group infusion preserves individual freedom within collective action, avoiding the authoritarian tendencies that plague political movements. This idea reflects Sartre's lifelong suspicion of authority, hierarchy, and institutional power, which he saw as threats to freedom. His political activism therefore was always marked by an anarchistic impulse, a refusal to let any structure, whether a party, a government, or an ideology, claim infallibility. Yet Sartre was no naive idealist. He understood that real change requires organization, strategy, and discipline. His challenge was to find a way to combine these necessities with the existential commitment to freedom, creativity, and authenticity. This is why he continually revised his political positions, refusing to settle into dogma, acknowledging mistakes, and adapting to new realities. His intellectual honesty, even when painful, became one of the most admirable aspects of his character. He embraced contradictions not as failures but as evidence of a mind that refused stagnation. And through all these transformations, Sartre maintained his core conviction that human beings are not defined by what has been done to them, but by what they choose to do next. This conviction fuels his reflections on art, literature, and culture, which he sees as essential arenas of freedom. For Sartre, a novel is not just a story but an invitation to self-recognition. A painting is not just an object but a challenge to perception. A philosophical work is not just a theory but a call to action. Art reveals possibilities, exposes hidden structures, disrupts habitual ways of seeing, and expands the imaginative horizon of a society. This is why Sartre insists that artists have a political responsibility, not in the sense of promoting propaganda, but in the sense of refusing complacency, refusing to turn away from injustices, refusing to hide behind aestheticism. The artist, like the philosopher, must confront their era, illuminate its contradictions, and provoke reflection. Sartre's belief in literature as action is also connected to his theory of reading, which frames the reader not as a passive consumer but as a collaborator who completes the work by interpreting it, engaging with it, and integrating it into their own worldview. This interactive conception of reading reflects Sartre's broader philosophical stance, that meaning is never fixed, that it emerges from the encounter between consciousness and world, self and other, writer and reader. And as we examine this dynamic vision of creation and reception, we begin to see how Sartre's entire philosophy, across ontology, ethics, psychology, literature, and politics, is united by a single underlying principle: the unyielding assertion that human beings are beings who make themselves, beings who transcend their given conditions, beings who are never finished, never settled, never reducible to facts. This is both the burden and the glory of the human condition, the source of our anguish and our dignity. Sartre's philosophy therefore stands as a monumental affirmation of human potential, even in the face of absurdity, oppression, and mortality. It is a call to reclaim our freedom, confront our choices, and acknowledge the profound responsibility we bear not only to ourselves but to the world we co-create with others. And this inexhaustible responsibility becomes even more pressing when Sartre turns his attention to history, because history for Sartre is not a neutral sequence of events but a dense web of human projects, conflicts, failures, and transformations, all driven by the intersecting freedoms of countless individuals whose choices radiate outward in unpredictable ways, creating new structures that in turn shape future possibilities. Sartre refuses to see history as deterministic or inevitable. Instead, he views it as a field of struggle where necessity and freedom collide, where material conditions constrain but do not eliminate agency, where every social order is both the product of past choices and the stage upon which new choices are made. This dialectical view of history allows Sartre to analyze oppression not as a metaphysical curse but as a concrete human creation sustained by fear, inertia, and bad faith. In Anti-Semite and Jew, for example, he examines antisemitism not as a mere prejudice but as a deliberate escape from freedom, a way for the antisemite to impose false clarity upon a chaotic world by projecting blame onto a mythical enemy. The antisemite, Sartre argues, is someone who flees responsibility by embracing irrational hatred, finding comfort in the solidity of prejudice because it relieves him of the burden to think, question, or change. This analysis reveals a darker side of bad faith, one that does not merely deceive oneself but actively imposes deception upon others through violence, discrimination, and exclusion. Yet Sartre insists that such hatred is neither necessary nor natural. It is a choice, and as such it can be countered through conscious resistance, solidarity, and the cultivation of authentic relations. Authenticity, however, is far from easy, because it requires confronting the structures that shape our lives while refusing to let them determine our essence. This tension becomes even more vivid in Sartre's analysis of class, where he acknowledges the profound impact of economic conditions on human existence while still insisting that individuals must take responsibility for how they respond to those conditions. In this sense, Sartre's philosophy is both compassionate and demanding. Compassionate because it recognizes the weight of circumstances, demanding because it refuses to allow circumstances to become excuses. This duality permeates his work on existential psychoanalysis, a method he develops to explore the deep motivations behind a person's choices without reducing those motivations to unconscious drives or mechanical determinism. Unlike Freud, Sartre does not believe in hidden psychic mechanisms. He believes that people conceal truths from themselves intentionally, through elaborate self-deceptions that mask painful responsibilities or unrealized possibilities. Existential psychoanalysis, then, is an attempt to uncover not what we are, but what we are trying to be through our actions, habits, and emotional patterns. It asks, what fundamental project gives coherence to your life? What are you striving to achieve or avoid through your choices? What image of yourself are you trying to sustain, and what truths do you bury in order to protect that image? These questions reveal that freedom is not only about external actions but about internal orientation, the deep project that shapes our interpretation of the world. And here Sartre identifies one of the greatest obstacles to authenticity, our fear of non-being. We cling to fixed identities, routines, relationships, and beliefs because the alternative, the open-endedness of freedom, is terrifying. But Sartre insists that clinging is itself a form of slow death, a stagnation of possibility that leads to resentment, boredom, and existential decay. This is why he claims that existence precedes essence. We are not defined by our past unless we choose to be. We are constantly surpassing ourselves, and this continual surpassing is the source of both our anguish and our creativity. Creativity, for Sartre, is not limited to the arts but is the fundamental structure of human existence. Every choice we make is a creative act that shapes the self and the world. In this sense, Sartre sees human beings as artists of their own lives, condemned to be free but also gifted with the ability to imagine and create new forms of being. This perspective leads him to articulate a vision of existential hope, one grounded not in metaphysical guarantees but in the irreducible power of human agency. Sartre acknowledges that the world is often unjust, absurd, and indifferent, but he insists that its meaning is not fixed. It emerges through our actions, our commitments, and our willingness to confront reality without illusions. This hope becomes even more radical in his later years, when he engages deeply with questions of solidarity, social justice, and global liberation. He argues that the oppressed, by fighting for their own freedom, simultaneously create conditions in which all humanity can become more free. Liberation, therefore, is not merely the removal of constraints but the expansion of collective possibility, the creation of a world in which more people can engage in the project of self-definition without fear or coercion. Sartre's defense of human rights, his denunciation of colonialism, his critique of capitalist exploitation, and his support for student uprisings all reflect this larger vision. A world where freedom is not just an abstract ideal but a lived reality. And yet Sartre is careful to emphasize that such a world will never be perfect. There will always be conflict, ambiguity, and uncertainty. The point is not to eliminate these conditions but to inhabit them courageously, using them as opportunities for growth rather than excuses for despair. This is why Sartre rejects both nihilism and naive optimism, choosing instead what he calls a lucid engagement, a form of responsibility that does not rely on guarantees but persists in spite of them. His own life embodied this ethos. He wrote tirelessly, marched in protests, challenged political leaders, refused prestigious honors, including the Nobel Prize, and maintained a fierce intellectual independence that often isolated him but also distinguished him as one of the most uncompromising thinkers of the 20th century. Even in his personal relationships, especially with Simone de Beauvoir, he sought to craft new forms of intimacy that defied convention, experimenting with a model of authentic love, grounded in mutual freedom rather than possession. Though the success of this experiment is debatable, its intention reflects the core of Sartre's philosophy, a refusal to accept inherited models of living without questioning their implications for freedom. This questioning extends to morality as well, for Sartre rejects the idea that moral rules can simply be applied like formulas. Instead, he argues that individuals must create their own values through their choices, taking full responsibility for the consequences. This does not mean that anything goes. Rather, it means that moral life is a creative process that requires reflection, courage, and a recognition of the interconnectedness of all freedoms. To act ethically, for Sartre, is to act in a way that respects the freedom of others, that expands rather than restricts human possibility. This commitment to freedom as the highest value gives Sartre's philosophy a profound moral urgency, one that challenges complacency and demands action. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own lives. The ways we avoid responsibility, the ways we limit ourselves, the ways we participate, consciously or unconsciously, in systems of oppression. Yet Sartre does not expose these truths to condemn us. He exposes them to invite transformation, to show that it is never too late to choose differently, to reclaim control over our lives, to become authors rather than spectators. And as we continue to explore Sartre's thought, we must keep in mind that his philosophy is ultimately a call to awakening, a call to recognize the radical freedom that defines us, a call to embrace the uncertainties of existence not as threats but as opportunities to shape our own destinies, because for Sartre, the meaning of life is not something we find but something we create. A creation that unfolds ceaselessly across time, shaped by every decision, hesitation, revolt, and reconciliation that emerges in the ongoing drama of human existence. And it is precisely this ceaseless unfolding that leads Sartre to rethink the very nature of meaning itself, not as a static property of the world but as an ever-evolving horizon produced through the interplay of consciousness, situation, and action. For Sartre, meaning is not discovered but projected. It is something we throw outward onto the world, transforming brute facts into lived significance through our engagement with them. A stone on the ground is just a stone until someone interprets it as an obstacle, a tool, a symbol, or a weapon, and through this act of interpretation the stone becomes part of a human project. This insight may seem simple but it carries enormous implications. It means that the world does not dictate our values, we do. It means that despair, hope, injustice, love and purpose are not inherent features of reality but expressions of how we choose to relate to it. This is why Sartre believes that even in the most oppressive circumstances, the individual retains a kernel of freedom, however small. Because freedom is not the ability to change external conditions but the ability to choose how we respond to them. This is the essence of his famous slogan that, "There is freedom even in chains," a phrase often misunderstood as optimism but which, in reality, is a description of the structural nature of consciousness itself. Consciousness, Sartre insists, is always a flight beyond the given. It is always more than what it is, always oriented toward possibilities rather than locked within facts. This does not mean that external limitations are unimportant. On the contrary, Sartre spends much of his later work analyzing how scarcity, violence, and institutional power crush or distort freedom. But it does mean that the human being is never reducible to a passive object. Even in situations of extreme constraint, we interpret, we imagine, we choose, and these choices define who we are. This definition is never final because identity for Sartre is not a fixed substance but a project. A continuous creation that stops only at death. Indeed, one of Sartre's most provocative claims is that we are not what we are and are what we are not, meaning that our essence is not the sum of our past but the anticipation of our future. We are always in the process of becoming, always leaning toward possibilities that have not yet materialized. This view of identity places enormous importance on intention and commitment, because what matters most for Sartre is not what we have done but what we are trying to do, what direction our freedom is taking. And here Sartre introduces the concept of authenticity, not as a fixed moral code but as a way of being in which we recognize our freedom, accept responsibility for it, and act in accordance with the projects we have freely chosen. To be authentic is to acknowledge the ambiguity of existence, the tension between facticity and transcendence, the impossibility of guaranteeing outcomes, and yet to act decisively nonetheless. It is to take ownership of one's situation without letting that situation define or excuse one's actions. But authenticity is difficult, because it requires continuous vigilance against the temptations of bad faith, the comforting lies we tell ourselves to avoid facing the truth of our freedom. Sartre identifies many forms of bad faith: the person who claims to be just following orders, the lover who pretends they have no choice but to stay or to leave, the intellectual who hides behind abstract theories, the bourgeois individual who claims moral purity while benefiting from unjust systems. In all these cases, the person denies their freedom in order to escape responsibility, pretending that their actions are determined by external forces. Yet Sartre insists that such denial is itself a choice to flee from oneself, and it is this flight that creates existential anguish. Anguish, for Sartre, is not a pathological condition but an awareness of the weight of freedom, a recognition that we are responsible not only for ourselves but for all humanity. This is because our actions implicitly declare what we consider a human being should be. Each choice affirms a vision of humanity that others may imitate. Thus, freedom is universal not in the sense that everyone possesses the same opportunities but in the sense that everyone's choices echo beyond themselves. Sartre's famous example is that of a man lying. When one person lies, he implies that lying is an acceptable way for humans to behave, and therefore his individual action contributes to shaping a broader moral horizon. This is why Sartre insists that in choosing for myself I choose for all, a phrase that underscores the profound interconnectedness of human freedom. This interconnectedness becomes even more central in his later work, where Sartre explores the idea of collective projects, the ways in which groups form, organize themselves, and pursue shared goals. In Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre analyzes how individuals unite under conditions of scarcity, forming what he calls serial groups, which are collections of individuals who share a situation but not a conscious unity, like commuters waiting for a bus. These serial groups can transform into fused groups when individuals recognize their shared interests and act collectively, as in a crowd rising up in revolt. But even fused groups are temporary, because the inertia of institutions eventually reintroduces hierarchy, bureaucracy, and alienation. Sartre sees this cycle as tragic but inevitable, a reflection of the tension between individual freedom and collective organization. Yet he refuses to give in to cynicism. Instead, he argues that human beings must continually struggle to maintain solidarity, continually reinvent social structures that allow freedom to flourish. This struggle is never-ending, but it is also the essence of historical progress. And this brings Sartre to one of his most powerful conclusions, that freedom is not a possession but a task, not a state but a constant effort, not a gift but a challenge to be taken up again and again. It is fragile, endangered by both external oppression and internal self-deception, but it is also resilient, constantly reborn in acts of courage, rebellion, creativity, and love. For despite his reputation as a philosopher of despair, Sartre is ultimately a philosopher of possibility. He believes that even in a world without God, without guarantees, without inherent meaning, the human being possesses an astonishing ability to imagine, to act, to transform, to resist, to rebuild, and to create new forms of life. In this sense, Sartre's philosophy is not a lament but a celebration of human potential, a call to embrace the uncertainty of existence as the very condition of freedom, to recognize that the absence of predetermined meaning is not a curse but an invitation to create meaning for ourselves, and to take seriously the responsibility this creation entails, because the world we inhabit is nothing other than the sum of our collective choices. And it is precisely this recognition, that the world is shaped, sculpted, bent, and reimagined through the ceaseless activity of human freedom, that pushes Sartre to confront the enormous ethical stakes of existence, for if nothing is predetermined, then everything depends on our actions, our commitments, and our willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of what we choose. This responsibility is not merely personal but also social and historical, because each act resonates into the world, helping to construct the structures within which others must then live. Sartre therefore rejects the comforting illusion that individuals exist in isolation. Instead, he argues that the self is always entangled with others, always woven into a fabric of mutual influence and shared conditions. This is why the encounter with the other, best illustrated in his famous analysis of the look, is so central to his philosophy. In the moment we feel ourselves seen by another consciousness, we become aware of ourselves as an object in their world, stripped of our subjective control, exposed and vulnerable. This experience reveals a tension at the heart of human relationships: the desire to be recognized as a free subject, and the simultaneous impulse to reduce others to objects through our gaze and expectations. Sartre sees love, domination, jealousy, pride, shame, and even courtesy as variations of this fundamental struggle between freedoms. Love, for instance, often becomes a trap. We want the beloved to freely choose us, but also to choose us in a way that feels necessary, eternal, guaranteed. Yet freedom can never be guaranteed without ceasing to be free. Thus, love becomes a paradox, always at risk of collapsing into possession or manipulation. But Sartre does not present this as proof that love is impossible. Rather, he argues that authentic love would require both individuals to recognize and affirm each other's freedom without attempting to imprison it, though he acknowledges how extraordinarily difficult this ideal is to achieve. This difficulty becomes even more apparent when Sartre turns to the political sphere. For if the interpersonal struggle between freedoms is complex, the collective struggle is infinitely more so, because it involves entire populations, institutions, and systems of power. Sartre's engagement with Marxism emerges from this realization. He sees economic and social structures as powerful forces that constrain freedom, not by eliminating it but by shaping the range of possibilities available to individuals. Capitalism, in his analysis, produces alienation not only through economic exploitation but also by treating human beings as objects to be bought, sold, managed, and measured. Yet Sartre refuses to abandon his existential commitment to individual freedom. Instead, he attempts to fuse existentialism with Marxism, arguing that historical conditions shape individuals but do not determine them completely. This synthesis is at the heart of his later philosophy, where he explores how individuals can resist oppressive structures, form collective movements, and create new forms of social existence. He sees revolt as one of the purest expressions of freedom, a moment when individuals break out of serial passivity and recognize themselves as agents capable of transforming their circumstances. Still, this transformation is fraught with tension, because every revolution risks reproducing the very structures it seeks to dismantle. Sartre's reflections on the French resistance, anti-colonial struggles, and global liberation movements push him to rethink the role of violence in politics. Not to glorify it, but to understand its tragic necessity in situations of extreme oppression. Violence, he argues, is often a reaction to violence already embedded in systems of domination, and while he does not celebrate this reality, he insists that ignoring it would be a form of moral evasion. Through all these analyses, Sartre returns again and again to the idea that freedom is both a burden and a source of dignity, both a challenge and a creative force. The human being, in his view, is a creature condemned to freedom, condemned because we cannot escape it, and yet elevated by it because it allows us to shape ourselves and our world. This duality produces existential emotions like anguish, despair, and abandonment, but it also produces courage, invention, and authenticity. Sartre's existential hero is not someone who remains calm or confident in the face of uncertainty but someone who acts despite uncertainty, who takes responsibility for choices without guarantees, who accepts that meaning must be made rather than found. This emphasis on commitment becomes especially clear in Sartre's own life, where he consistently aligned his philosophical positions with political action, from resisting fascism to supporting anti-colonial movements to critiquing authoritarianism of every kind. For Sartre, the philosopher is not a detached observer but an engaged participant in the world, someone whose ideas must be lived rather than merely theorized. As we follow this line of thought deeper, we arrive at one of Sartre's most provocative ideas: that human beings create themselves through narrative, through the stories they tell about their past, their intentions, their failures, and their hopes. But these stories are never final because the future remains open. Meaning is a horizon that recedes as we move toward it, always shaped by new experiences and choices. This is why Sartre insists that death is the only moment when a life acquires a fixed meaning, because only then can the story no longer be rewritten. Until that point, we remain unfinished beings, perpetually in motion, perpetually redefining ourselves in relation to the world. This openness can be terrifying, but it is also the source of our creative power, the reason we can transform not only ourselves but the world around us. Sartre's philosophy encourages us to embrace this unfinishedness, to resist the temptation of rigid identities and absolute certainties, and to recognize that ambiguity is not a flaw in human existence but its very essence. Through this lens, the human condition becomes a vast field of possibilities, a landscape where each action is a brushstroke in the creation of a life that has no predetermined design. And it is here that Sartre's existentialism reaches its most profound insight. That freedom is not simply the ability to choose but the responsibility to choose well, to choose in a way that acknowledges our interconnectedness with others, to choose with an awareness that our decisions help shape the world in which future generations will live. In this sense, existentialism becomes not merely a philosophy of the individual but a philosophy of collective responsibility, a call to create a world that reflects the values we wish to affirm. Sartre does not offer easy answers or comforting doctrine. Instead, he offers a challenge to confront our own evasions, to live intentionally, to accept the risks of freedom, and to participate actively in the ongoing project of human history.